At that point, I was posting on the internet. This book was written on the internet. My website is RICHARDCHARNIN.com. I started posting on the internet in 2001 on the Democratic Underground, which has become the largest political site. I was banned in 2005. The reasons I'm not going to go into, but suffice it to say that I was doing analysis and posting it, and certain individuals came over every time I posted to try to tear my work apart. These were disinformationists, and they're still around. They did not want to logically debate the issue. For instance, let's go back to 2004 exit poll. Now you all know what exit polls are, right? Okay. John Kerry was leading the early exit polls by about 3 to 5% over Bush. However, and I'm talking about the unadjusted exit poll, it turns out Kerry had a 5% lead. We found that out subsequently. But the votes were coming in for Bush. Now you had this divergence between the exit polls and the incoming vote count. They were completely opposite. Dan Rather and Jennings, everybody was talking about Kerry being the next president. But all of a sudden, as I said, Bush was in an apparent lead. The votes that were coming in showed that he was winning, and the exit polls were wrong. Of course, that's what the media would like you to believe, that the exit polls were wrong and the recorded vote was right. The media is part and parcel of the myth that our elections are fair. The media won't talk about it. Okay. All the way up till 12:22 a.m., after the election polls closed, Kerry was leading by 3 to 4% in the exit polls after the polls closed. But it's, now this, if you go home with anything tonight, go home with this. It is standard operating procedure for the exit polls to be forced to match the recorded vote, even if the recorded vote is fraudulent. Remember that, and that's the key to the whole thing. That's exactly what they did. There were 13,000 respondents in the national exit poll. Kerry was ahead by 3%. At 12:22 a.m., after the polls had closed in California, at 1 a.m., and he was ahead by, he had 54% in Ohio, 54%. He won Ohio by 500,000 votes. Okay. 1 o'clock, all of a sudden, the polls flipped, the exit polls flipped, and showed that Bush won Ohio and Bush won Florida. It was impossible. There were 13,000 respondents in the national exit poll. Actually, 100,000 people were polled. You had 100,000 in 50 states. But there was a subset for the so-called national exit poll. Kerry led in all the states with 52%. He led the national subset with 51%. With just 600 additional respondents added to the 13,000, that was sufficient to flip the vote from 51-48 for Kerry to 51-48 for Bush. In other words, Bush had to take all those additional 600 respondents, had to say they voted for Bush, and Kerry had to lose respondents. Now, how do you lose people who said that they voted for Kerry? Now, understand that exit polls are used all over the world. They are better than pre-election polls. They're very, very precise, very accurate, very scientific. They have a 1% margin of error. what Bush did in 2004, when the exit polls finally released their report, in the day before Bush's inaugural in January of 2005, his re-election, they provided unadjusted exit poll data from 1988 to 2004. Not just 2004. This was a 2004 report. But they provided all this information in 77 pages, but nobody read it. The media didn't read it. If they would have read it, and they would have analyzed the numbers, they would have seen that it was a sham. The pollsters' excuse for why they were off by 6.5% was that Bush voters were very shy. They didn't want to talk to the exit polls. That's exactly what they said. They had no other explanation to account for that vast discrepancy, which was far beyond the margin of error. Of course, the media picked up on it when they gave these excuses. Well, Bush, Karl Rove brought out 4 million new Christian fundamentalists to vote. That's a myth. There were 22 million new voters in 2004. The Democrats were registering voters at 6-1 over the Republicans. Kerry had about 60% of new voters. He had about 80% of returning Nader voters. He had about 91% of returning Gore voters. So how did he lose? The only other category, returning Bush voters. That's the only category that Bush won. But even assuming that there was Bush voters and Gore voters were, let's say, canceled each other out, you still had the new voters and you had the returning Nader voters. And they sure didn't vote for Bush. Nader voters were like 5-1 voted for Kerry. Okay, so there's a tremendous amount of evidence that, you know, if you just apply simple logic, you realize that our system is totally corrupted and has been and continues to be. Now, one other thing I'll throw at you, I have to always, just a little probability. I mentioned the fact that this exit polls provided unadjusted exit poll data going from 1988 to 2008 and 2004. They didn't do it for 2008. By that time, they learned their lesson. They realized they better not release that information because people were up to their game. Okay, but in those 6 elections, from 1988 to 2004, they provided unadjusted exit poll data for each state in each election. Actually, where they took the exit polls, so you had 6 elections, 1988, 2002, 1992, 6 elections, I guess. There were actually 238 exit polls in those 6 elections. You would normally expect that because the exit poll margin of error is so tight, that 12 of the 238, from 1988 to 2004, 12 of those state exit polls would exceed the margin of error. And so I did an analysis where I even assumed, I was very conservative, I assumed a 3% margin of error. And we know that the margin of error is much lower than that, probably 1 to 2%. In any case, not to bore you with the numbers, you have to be able to grasp this to fully appreciate what I'm saying. Of the 238 exit polls, state exit polls, 65 exceeded the margin of error. One would normally expect 12 to exceed the margin of error. Now, the odds against that are virtually 0. I mean, there may be 1 divided by trillions, okay? I don't even have the number on it. But it's 1 divided by trillions. But that's not the whole story. Of the 65 that exceeded the margin of error, 64 were in favor of the Republican. So what you have is a 0 probability that 65 would exceed the margin error, and you have a 0 probability that 64 of the 65 would go in one direction. Can you appreciate that? You don't have to be a math whiz. So but I did the calculations. I do it in a spreadsheet called Excel. I've been doing spreadsheets since 1982. I was the first guy on Wall Street to do spreadsheets to analyze mergers and acquisitions and to do financial forecasting, corporate finance.